There once was a kingdom with many different religious sects who constantly argued over metaphysical truths. Is the world eternal, or is it finite? Does a person who has attained enlightenment live after death, or do they perish like the rest of us? Seeing this unrest, the king gathered blind men and brought before them an elephant. Each was allowed to feel only one part, but describe the whole elephant. The one who touched the head said it felt like a jar. Another, who felt the tusk, insisted it was a spear. So soon they were arguing over what the elephant truly was. This is the Buddhist parable of the blind men, and it perfectly encapsulates the limited subjectivity of our belief systems. The Buddha believed that people only see different sides of the whole, and so they engage in petty quarrels. In more recent interpretations, this parable is used to suggest that just as the blind men had one part of the elephant, each religion is simply one aspect of a larger truth. Religious thinkers from the Renaissance thought something similar when they uncovered what they believed was evidence of an ancient theology in texts believed to be written by an Egyptian saint named Hermes Trismegistus, who translated to Hermes thrice greatest, which, by the way, is just such a cool name. The Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino believed this body of writing was the first text to reflect an ancient theology, or Prisca Theologica, which they believed had the true theology that threads through all major religions and many different philosophies. The notion that all religions share a common theology is appealing for several reasons. It implies that there's no reason to fight over which is true, as they're all just perspectives on the one truth. Thus, it supports religious pluralism and almost demands tolerance and respect for other forms of worship. And it's a nice story, but ultimately, is it true or even plausible? Is there really an ancient theology that connects all religions and many great thinkers? Well, for one, Hermes could not have been the first sage. His writings were later found to have originated in late antiquity, so that's long after Plato. As a result, Hermes would have then been a beneficiary of the work of ancient Greek philosophy and existing religions. We know this because the writings of Hermes come from the period when Greek and Egyptian cultures overlapped and merged in Egypt. But while this ancient theology may not be accurate, it does point to something important. For most major religions, there are common threads that are worth exploring at different levels of belief that exist in almost every religious or philosophical belief system. I don't subscribe to the notion that all religions are the same. There are important differences that matter. But in the most popular religions, levels of belief are often implied. Sometimes it's the followers of a religion that makes these distinctions clear, thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, and sometimes it's in the great texts. Regardless, we can see an implied structure of belief, a path from immaturity to mature religiosity. And that may not be a straight arrow, but there are clearly higher and lower levels to consider that may be useful to you for whatever path that you decide to take. And now I want to go into the first level of belief. Level 1, the pursuer of pleasure. The first level represents someone who has not seriously engaged with any religion. I'm not simply referring to an atheist or an agnostic, however. This is a person who is consumed by the pursuit of pleasure. Many religions and ancient philosophies specifically targeted this dogged pursuit of pleasure, where a person holds pleasure as their highest aim. You can see this in the Bible, the Quran, Buddhist texts, the Analects, and the Bhagavad Gita, Plato, Stoicism, and much, much more. The only school of Greek philosophy that frames pleasure as a positive aim is Epicureanism. This fundamentally hedonist school of thought where you evaluate things based on the pleasure gained and the pain that you avoid. It's not so much about being fed grapes in the middle of an orgy, although that would be perfectly fine if you're an Epicurean. In the Bible, the pursuit of pleasure is largely associated with sin. It's considered a temporary joy that ultimately leads to misery and pain. It's only the consequences of sin that have a lasting effect both in life and life after death. The Quran considers pleasure a sin if it becomes an end in itself, distracting one's focus away from God. In Buddhism, our desire and attachment to worldly pleasures are primary causes for suffering. Our pleasure is only temporary. When we let ourselves become attached to it, we doom ourselves to an endless cycle of suffering. The problem is not the object of the desire, but the desire itself and our attempts to hold on to worldly things. When we let ourselves become attached to it, we doom ourselves to an endless cycle of suffering. The problem is not the object of the desire, but the desire itself and our attempts to hold on to worldly things. When Nietzsche wrote about the death of God, one of his main concerns was that humanity would do after moving beyond religion. He came up with the concept of the last man to describe the unfortunate ways people grapple with nihilism. The last man responds in one of a few ways. They either comfort themselves with illusory beliefs, sink into a deep depression, or preoccupy themselves with entertainment. In the latter case, pleasure has become their highest aim, and in the century and a half since Nietzsche's writing, it seems that the pursuit of pleasure has truly become the last man's primary coping strategy. The Christian existentialist Soren Kierkegaard offers one of the most thorough accounts of the pleasure seeker in the first volume of his book, Either Or. In the last section, The Diary of the Seducer, the first-person narrator Johannes is a self-described aesthete, someone whose aim is to maximize their pleasure. His main aim is to pursue love in its most exciting form, without commitment or any greater meaning. In his own words, I am an aesthete, an eroticist, someone who believes in love and knows it from the ground up, and only makes the private reservation that no love affair should last more than 6 months at the most. In the diary, Johannes courts a woman in a way designed to bring him the greatest pleasure. Once he sees the potential object of his affection, a woman named Cordelia, he embarks on a game of seduction. He learns as much as he can about her and inserts himself into her life. Johannes then moves forward with his conquest by befriending Edward, a man who is deeply in love with Cordelia. Johannes coaches him, only to swoop in and steal Cordelia's hand before Edward can request an engagement. Through letters and in-person encounters, Johannes slowly convinces Cordelia to sleep with him before marriage. After their night together, Johannes has no interest in seeing her again. He has gotten all the pleasure he wanted from their courtship and cruelly discards her. So, what was Kierkegaard's point in this tale of pleasure and cruelty? It was, ultimately, along with the rest of Either Or, to demonstrate how the life of the aesthete, no matter how calculated, leads to disillusionment and despair. Another level of belief is required to avoid such a dissatisfying fate, however. While researching for this video, I had to learn a lot about many different religions, philosophies, and schools of thought. Many of these have their own books that I had to read to truly understand, but with limited time, there was no way that I could really sit down and read every single book cover to cover. I just couldn't have gotten the information I needed if I didn't use Shortform, the sponsor of today's episode. Shortform makes the best nonfiction guides that I've come across, and they're not just summaries. They break down books into the core ideas, explain why they matter, and most importantly, how to actually apply them in the real world. While working on this video, I read Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And short form helped me understand the psychological insights behind Buddhist philosophy, especially the way our mind creates suffering through craving, ego, and constant dissatisfaction, all in a quick, digestible format. Beyond books, short form also has article guides and podcast guides covering topics like psychology, money, philosophy, technology, and so much more. They're all built from multiple perspectives, so you can actually understand the subject, not just skim through it. If you want to finally stop forgetting the ideas that once changed how you think, you can join Shortform through my link at shortform.com/aperture, or by clicking the link in the description to get $50 off the annual plan. Level 2. Inherited faith. Odds are that most people you interact with on a daily basis don't seem particularly religious. They don't bring up religious values, nor do they take the time to actively participate in religious practice. And yet, you see polls suggesting that the majority of people identify as belonging to one religion or another. The people you know may offhand suggest that they're Catholic, for example, despite the fact that you know that they don't go to church or pray the rosary. They say they belong to a religion, a lot like the way you might identify with the country you're born in. Rather than treating religion like a choice to pursue a belief system, it's more like saying you're a Capricorn because you were born in January. This is a telltale sign that someone has inherited their faith. They identify as Christian or Hindu or what have you because their parents did. They may even go to church regularly, but don't seem particularly interested in reading the Bible for themselves. Obviously, your family has a significant impact on which belief system you identify with, but culture plays an enormous role as well. A person growing up in a nation that is overwhelmingly of one religion is more likely to identify with that faith. As with family influence, this identification can easily be a surface-level belief. Soren Kierkegaard took issue with this lackadaisical level of belief. He famously insisted that we are not born a Christian, rather we have to become one. In his book, Attack Upon Christendom, Kierkegaard criticizes the idea that simply being born in Denmark makes you a Christian. He felt that the church had tried to make Christianity so accessible that it no longer reflected the New Testament. It made everyone a Christian by default, and when everyone is a Christian in this way, it doesn't exist. I want to take a moment to express my sympathies with those who stay at this level of belief. Many people identify with their parents' religion because it gives them a sense of belonging. To reject their inherited faith might entail walking away from a family or just becoming less involved. They may also not want to feel like an outsider in their community. In some cases, being an outsider has very serious consequences, which brings us to the next level of belief. Belief out of fear of authority. Humanity has a long history of imposing religious belief systems on unwilling participants. For over 300 years, the Spanish monarchy enforced Catholic orthodoxy. They prosecuted hundreds of thousands of people whom they believed were secretly practicing other faiths, such as Judaism or Islam. They killed thousands and expelled hundreds of thousands of Muslims and Jews. In the process, they created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. These trials and killings were famously carried out by the Spanish Inquisition, which became well known and feared for its methods of torture and secret trials. The history of religious persecution is filled with violence and brutality, but you don't need the threat of death to coerce others into belief. Religious communities routinely ostracize and outcast people for turning their back on their faith. They often stand to lose everything they care about, including their families and their homes. So that's human authority. But we also need to consider divine authority. In Christianity, there are huge consequences for not believing. You risk eternal damnation and all that entails. Much of what we imagine to be hell was conceived in literature, such as Dante's Inferno, but regardless, it doesn't sound pleasant. Some believe in a religion, not out of love, but out of fear of the post-mortem consequences. You either believe and you're safe, or you don't believe and you risk severe punishment. The philosopher Blaise Pascal turned this ultimatum into a case for believing in God. In Pascal's wager, you weigh the possibility of eternal damnation versus believing in God and receiving the reward in heaven. For him, this was a no-brainer. Obviously, you should choose God. What do you have to lose? However, there are more considerations involved in this simple wager. There's the fact that you still have to place a bet on a specific God. You still ultimately have to gamble, whether that's on religion being true or false, or on a specific religion among thousands that exist, with many different consequences for choosing incorrectly. Perhaps more importantly, choosing to believe in God out of fear doesn't get you all the way there. You have to buy in, which means overcoming your skepticism. One common way people do this is by moving to the next level of belief. Level 4, self-interest. What's in it for me? That's often why many of us buy into religion, or at least it's a fair starting point. As Pascal implied in his wager, there's plenty to gain from adopting religious beliefs. What could be greater than the promise of an eternal heaven or preventing eternal damnation? Something almost everyone struggles with is the possibility of the endless night. Without a belief in the afterlife, life just ends. Your consciousness ceases and everything you know, all your experiences and your bonds with others, they just no longer exist for you. To suggest that they're out of reach would be inaccurate, as there is nothing left for you to reach. There are, however, helpful philosophical angles for this problem. Epicurus famously said something to the effect of, "Death does not concern us because as long as we exist, death is not here, and once it does come, we no longer exist." It's a nice way of viewing the problem of death, but it doesn't quite erase the anxieties and the despair of that endless night. In Fear and Trembling, Soren Kierkegaard writes, "If a human being did not have an eternal consciousness, if underlying everything there were only a wild, fermenting power that, writhing in dark passions, produced everything, be it significant or insignificant, if a vast, never-appeased emptiness hid beneath everything, what would life be then but despair?" This take is perhaps a bit dramatic, but it does point to what is gained: eternal life and the end of existential despair. Not every religion promises an afterlife, but they all have an approach to the problem of death. Buddhism often takes a different approach to the question of eternal life, which is illustrated well in the Sutta Pitaka. The story is a dialogue between the Buddha and a monk named Milankyaputta. The monk suggests that the Buddha has ignored many important metaphysical questions, such as what happens after death. He threatens to quit unless he gets some answers. The Buddha responds with an analogy, as he often does. He asks the monk to imagine someone struck with a poison-tipped arrow, but instead of just letting the surgeon remove it, the injured person states, "I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow that wounded me until I know if the man who wounded me was tall, short, middle height, dark or brown or gold-skinned, whether the man lived in a village or town or city, and so on." The Buddha goes on with more details, but the point is that the man dies long before he gets answers to his question. For the Buddha, the poisoned arrow is the urgent matter that needs to be addressed. The poisoned arrow in the analogy represents our suffering that arises from our endless craving. Before bothering with the questions of the afterlife and the cosmos, we should first end the suffering that plagues us. In Buddhism, enlightenment is not only the cessation of desire for lasting pleasure, but also the detachment from the self and the eternal soul. It resolves our concerns for the endless night by removing our desire to go on. It pulls out the poisoned arrow that causes us to despair to begin with. Getting into Buddhism starts with the promise of what is gained in this life, the end of our suffering. It's in our self-interest, even if it involves acknowledging that there is no self. Level 5, taking responsibility. At this stage, you are more willing to examine your religion and ask important questions. You'll scrutinize the meaning of texts and try to understand how they all fit together. This is also, unfortunately, when people are most likely to leave their religious communities, especially if they don't get satisfying answers to their questions. Your approach to religion may become very rational. You reject things that seem illogical or contradictory, and you're willing to point them out. This is why this stage can be filled with conflict. Some choose to return to their old way of thinking about belief, while others continue to grapple with its complexity, leading to a more complex understanding of their religion. In the Theravada branch of Buddhism, there are 4 stages of enlightenment. When one enters the first stage, Sotapanna, they've stopped believing that following rites and rituals will lead to enlightenment. In this first stage, they intimately recognize that there's no permanent self or eternal soul. They no longer doubt the path as they know it works and have given them a sense of happiness and freedom. In this level of belief, you're taking control and you've committed to diving deeper into your religion. Once you've taken responsibility for your own belief, there's still a significant path ahead. How will you reckon with the truth of your religion now that you've bought in on a deeply personal level? You may be inclined to pursue it rigorously and with the urgency that your commitment demands of you. We're talking about changing the way you live every day and making real sacrifices. Level 6, religious maturity. At this level, you've honed your focus on a divine purpose. You're less torn between worldly concerns and your belief as you've let religion become the focus of your life. This is a level that most people do not achieve and are probably not interested in attaining. This stage often results in a form of asceticism. That's when you forego worldly pleasures and relationships to focus on the divine. Monks are what we typically associate with this level of religious belief. In Hinduism, this level of religious maturity is called the sannyasa stage of life. This is where you reject material desires and, importantly, your prejudices against others. In the Hindu faith, it's important not to treat others as completely separate from yourself. The deity, Brahman, pervades all things and all people. Mistreating others is to injure yourself, which is a strange thing to do. Why would you do that? In Buddhism's third stage of enlightenment, one's sense of desire has completely ended. You no longer wrestle with craving. Similar to the sannyasa stage in Hinduism, your sense of compassion is unconditional. You no longer hold ill will towards others. The Buddha, however, warned against extreme asceticism. His doctrine of the middle way suggests finding a path between indulging in sensual pleasures and self-mortification. The point is not to starve yourself of pleasure, but to reduce your attachment to them. The ideal lifestyle, then, would still be modest and simple, but not one that actively punishes you. In Kierkegaard's text, The Purity of Heart is to will one thing, he describes this religious stage of maturity. You move on from double-mindedness, where you are distracted by pleasures and selfishness, and focus on the good. Kierkegaard describes this person as the knight of infinite resignation. They've given up everything in this world to focus on achieving the eternal life in the next. They no longer consider the temporary to be worthwhile. It's just a distraction from God. When you believe in your religion at this state of maturity, you don't feel the need to put off focusing on it. It becomes the passion project that you can't put down. It's the video game you stay up until 2 a.m. trying to beat. You're going for that high score with the divine, and you refuse to put that controller down, even if that means going hungry and ignoring all other worldly things. Now, imagine for a second they made religion a video game. On second thought, forget that. They probably have, and it was likely terrible. Anyway. You might be thinking at this point that we're at the end of the levels of religiosity. Belief at this stage is strong and true and can't be doubted. How can you get any higher than that? Well, the truth is we have one more level of belief. I know that seems impossible, but it's true. The last level is about taking that religious intensity and doing something very important. Level 7. Letting go. In his writings, Kierkegaard identified 3 spheres of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. But within the religious sphere, there are 2 types: religiousness A and religiousness B. A is the ascetic life I just discussed, the person who focuses on God and rejects worldly pleasures. Religious B is our final level of belief. They've made a leap of faith that religiousness A hasn't. Becoming an ascetic and focusing on God is firmly in our control, but to take a leap of faith is to completely rely on the divine. It is to relinquish control. To have faith is to make a logical leap. In monotheistic religions, you have to buy into the idea that there is only one God. And in the case of Christianity, sort of 3, sort of 1, it's a bit of a mess. The paradox is the point. Anyway, there's no objective proof for God's existence. If there were, there would be no room for faith. You would just believe in God like the way you would believe in the shoes on your feet. To believe is to take a leap of faith, which Kierkegaard suggests may put you at odds with reason and even human ethics. It may make you isolated and lonely, as it's a subjective experience that cannot be explained rationally to others. To truly believe in God is to subjectively believe rather than rely on others and supposed proofs. In the history of religions and philosophy, there have been many arguments for and against the objective existence of God. For Kierkegaard, that's sort of a waste of time. If God could be objectively proven, there would be no reason for faith, and thus there's no personal commitment. You have the math right there. But by having faith, you let go of your need to control your religious fate. You trust, despite how absurd it may seem. You don't try to learn or come up with objective truths for why you believe in what you do. There are too many mysteries and paradoxes in transcendent truth, making a comprehensive explanation nearly impossible. You have to let go of objective certainty. In the 9th century, a Buddhist monk named Linji Yizhuan told his disciples, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." It's a provocative piece of advice, but what does that mean exactly? Ultimately, it is the idea to kill your conceptualization of the Buddha. You have to let go of external authorities and even your own conceptualizations of spiritual beliefs. Your experience of enlightenment will be personal and inward. In Zen Buddhism, you're looking for the mind beneath all formal structures, such as logic and words. You're trying to exist purely in the moment. You have to move beyond thinking of the Buddha and specific doctrines. You have to forget the path and guidance. You have to kill the Buddha to get to the real nature of one's own mind. Taoist philosophy is focused on letting go of a greater purpose and embracing a way, also known as the Tao. Instead of focusing solely on a god and serving its will, Taoists are encouraged to practice Wu Wei, roughly translated as non-purposeful action. In Taoism, the universe is generated by cosmic order that, if followed, can lead to flourishing. When you act without a greater purpose in mind, whether that's a project or self-interest-based goals, you're more able to go with the natural flow of the universe. The less purposeful your action, the more you let the order of the universe flow unimpeded. And that is the final level of belief. While each example is different, they all, in the end, imply letting go of something that we come to hold too tightly, even if we came to grip it because of our religions to begin with. So maybe the blind men were never meant to agree about the elephant. Maybe the point was not to collapse every religion into one indistinguishable truth, but to recognize the limits of our grip on it. Across traditions, across centuries, we see the same movement. From pleasure to inheritance, to fear, to self-interest, responsibility, devotion, and finally, to surrender. Not surrender as if in defeat, but surrender as in release. the release of certainty, the release of ego, the release of the need to be right. At the highest level of belief, you are no longer clinging to the tusk or the trunk or the tail. You loosen your hands entirely. And strangely, that may be the closest anyone ever comes to understanding just how ginormous the elephant is. Not by feeling for its individual parts, but by moving back and feeling the amount of light and wind that it blocks out.